Tonight, we're starting somewhere familiar. An iconic fast food name. Burger King, a place you've likely seen many times, often without really noticing it. An empty parking lot. Late at night. A building still softly lit from the inside. The glow of windows against the dark. A sign that's easy to recognize, even from a distance. A place that's open when many others are closed. Fast food restaurants are part of the background of modern life. They're there on long drives, late evenings, quiet nights when nothing else is open. Most of the time we pass them without thinking. They simply exist, steady, familiar, and predictable. Tonight, we're not here to judge them, and we're not here to analyze them quickly. After that quiet hello, after imagining people listening from different places, we can let the world outside slow down again. Picture an empty parking lot, not completely dark, just softly lit, painted lines on the ground, a few light poles humming quietly, no rush, no movement. Inside the building, the lights are still on, warm interior light spilling gently through the windows, tables waiting, counters clean, chairs pushed in. Nothing is happening, and that's the point. These buildings aren't performing right now. They're not advertising, they're not competing, they're simply there, waiting for the next person who needs something familiar, waiting for the next quiet moment in someone else's night. At times like this, a place like this feels almost different, less like a business, and more like part of the landscape. Something steady, something predictable, something that doesn't ask anything from you. This stillness is easy to miss during the day, but at night, it becomes visible. And that's the pace we'll keep tonight. Slow, unhurried, observant. We're letting the noise fall away so we can notice the simple shape of things as they rest. As we stay with this quiet moment, it helps to let go of the way we usually think about companies. Most of the time, we're taught to look quickly, to compare, to judge, to decide what's better or worse. Tonight, we're doing something different. We're not rushing toward conclusions. We're not searching for secrets. And we're not trying to learn anything all at once. We're simply observing. Looking at a company the way you might look at a familiar street late at night, not to analyze it, but to notice that it's there. This story isn't about success or failure. It isn't about competition or rankings. It's about systems, and how those systems quietly settle into everyday life. If you miss a detail, that's completely fine. If your attention drifts, that's expected. You don't need to follow every idea. You don't need to remember names or dates. This is a sleep documentary. You can listen actively, or you can let the sound of the story become background noise as your thoughts slow down. From here on, we'll move gently through time. Back to a moment before fast food had a clear shape. Before places like this became so familiar that we stopped noticing them at all. For now, there's nothing you need to do. Just stay comfortable. Let the pace remain slow, and allow the story to unfold quietly. Before we continue, it helps to understand how this story is meant to be heard. This isn't a documentary built around revelations. There won't be moments you need to remember, or arguments you need to follow. We're not here to decide whether something is good or bad. And we're not trying to uncover anything hidden. This is a sleep documentary. That means the story is allowed to move in the background. You don't need to keep track of names or dates. If you miss a detail, nothing important is lost. What we're doing instead is noticing patterns, how certain ideas repeat, how familiar systems settle into everyday life, how something ordinary becomes almost invisible over time. When urgency is removed, attention behaves differently. Not sharper, just softer. You may notice things without trying to, or you may simply rest while the story continues nearby. Either way is fine. From here, we'll begin to move backward, not quickly, but carefully, to a time before fast food looked the way it does now, before standardized kitchens, before recognizable chains, before places like Burger King blended so easily into the background. You don't need to prepare for that. Just remain comfortable and let the story continue. Before eating away from home became routine, it was something people planned for. Most meals were eaten close to where they were prepared, in homes, in familiar kitchens, as part of the rhythm of daily life. Leaving home to eat was uncommon, and usually tied to a reason: travel. Work that carried someone far from home. A journey that could not easily be completed in a single day. For much of history, travel itself moved slowly. Distances were felt more clearly. Stopping was expected. When people ate away from home, the meal marked a pause in the journey. Not a convenience, but a moment to rest. Food on the road wasn't chosen for speed or variety. It was chosen because the body needed it. A place to sit, a place to recover before continuing on. These meals were shaped by where you happened to stop, by who was cooking, by what was available that day. Consistency wasn't expected. Each place was its own experience. A meal eaten away from home stood apart from daily routine. It felt different because it was different. Eating elsewhere wasn't something done casually. It carried intention. As travel slowly became more common, stops to eat became more frequent. Small roadside kitchens appeared. Simple meals served to people passing through. Still, eating away from home remained tied to movement. You ate because you were going somewhere, or because you had already come a long way. Restaurants did not compete for attention. They served whoever arrived. Food was filling, straightforward, and unhurried. Meals were moments of rest, not something to move through quickly. In this earlier time, eating away from home was rare enough to be noticed. It interrupted the day in a meaningful way. Understanding this helps explain what comes later, when eating away from home becomes ordinary and eventually expected. For now, it's enough to remember that it was once different, intentional, tied to travel, and never rushed. As more people began to travel, places to eat appeared along the way. Not chains, not systems. Individual restaurants, often owned and run by a single person or family. Diners along highways, small drive-ins near growing towns. Roadside stops that existed simply because travelers needed to pause. These places reflected the people who ran them. Menus were shaped by personal taste, by family recipes, by what could be cooked well in a small kitchen. A diner might be known for its coffee, another for a particular sandwich, another simply for being open late. Nothing was standardized. If you stopped at two diners on the same road, they would feel completely different. The food, the pace, the atmosphere. Even the hours could change from day to day. This was accepted without question. A restaurant wasn't expected to be familiar. It was expected to be itself. Personality mattered more than consistency. The owner's presence was often felt everywhere, in the way food was prepared, in how customers were greeted, in how long people were welcome to stay. Some places encouraged conversation, others were quiet. Some felt warm and informal, others strict and efficient. None of this was hidden. It was part of the experience. Eating at these places meant adapting to them, not the other way around. You learned what this diner did well, what it didn't, and you adjusted your expectations accordingly. If you returned months later, things might be different. A new cook, a changed menu, a slightly altered rhythm. There was no promise of sameness. What you received depended on timing, on people, on circumstance. These roadside restaurants served an important role. They gave travelers rest. They gave communities a gathering place. They provided food without asking for loyalty. You stopped because you were there, not because you recognized a name. In this world, eating away from home was still personal. It carried the imprint of the people behind it. And while this made each place unique, it also made them fragile. When the owner left, or the road changed, or travel patterns shifted, the restaurant often disappeared with them. For a time, this was simply how things worked. In these early restaurants, food was shaped by people more than process. Cooking relied on individual skill, on experience built over time, on knowing when something was ready by sight or feel, rather than by instruction. The quality of a meal depended on who was working that day. A good cook could make a simple dish memorable. A tired one might produce something forgettable. This variability was expected. It was understood that food reflected the hands that made it. There were no detailed manuals, no standardized steps measured to the second, no expectation that two meals prepared in different places would taste the same. Each kitchen had its own rhythm. Some cooks moved quickly, others worked slowly and carefully. Some relied on habit, others on intuition. These differences gave meals personality, but they also created limits. When cooking depends on individual skill, it becomes difficult to repeat at scale. Training took time. Experience couldn't be rushed. If a restaurant became busy, quality might suffer. If a skilled cook left, the food changed. Growth meant adding more people, each with their own habits and abilities. There was no simple way to ensure sameness from one day to the next, let alone from one location to another. For small local restaurants, this was acceptable. They served a limited number of people, in familiar surroundings, with expectations shaped by proximity and trust. But as travel increased and eating away from home became more frequent, these limits became clearer. People began to want reliability, not perfection, but predictability. They wanted to know roughly what a meal would be like before sitting down. Food made primarily by individual skill could not easily provide that. It was deeply human, but difficult to replicate. This way of cooking worked well on a small scale, where relationships mattered more than efficiency. But it could not follow people everywhere they went, and so, gradually, the idea of food prepared by systems, rather than solely by individuals, began to take shape, not all at once, and not without resistance, but slowly, as the world around it changed. When Burger King first appeared, it did not arrive with a clear sense of destiny. It began as a single restaurant in Florida, serving a limited menu to a local audience. There was no expectation that it would become familiar far beyond its original neighborhood. The goal was simple: serve food efficiently, meet local demand, operate within the rhythms of the day. At this stage, the restaurant was responding to its surroundings, not trying to reshape them. It existed among many other small eating places, each offering its own version of convenience and familiarity. There was no master plan for national expansion, no carefully defined brand identity. What mattered most was whether the restaurant worked in its immediate context. Could orders be filled consistently? Could customers be served without long waits? Could the kitchen handle steady flow during busy hours? These were practical questions, not strategic ones. Menus were kept small, not because of philosophy, but because simplicity made daily operations easier. Decisions were made with the present in mind. What helped today? What reduced problems tomorrow? The restaurant's early success came not from innovation, but from alignment. The food fit the setting. The service fit the pace of local life. Customers returned because the experience made sense, not because it promised something new. At this stage, Burger King was not yet a system. It was a place, one location, one kitchen, one group of people working through familiar routines. Only later would these routines begin to repeat elsewhere. For now, they were simply being refined where they started. In its earliest days, the menu was small, not as a statement and not as a strategy, but because fewer items were easier to manage. Each additional choice added complexity, more ingredients to track, more steps in the kitchen, more chances for something to slow down. Keeping the menu limited helped the day move smoothly. Customers arrived with modest expectations. They weren't looking for variety. They were looking for something familiar and filling. The restaurant served what it could serve well, within the limits of its space and staff. There was no pressure to offer something for everyone, no need to constantly introduce new items. What mattered was that the food made sense for the setting. A small menu allowed the kitchen to settle into rhythm. Tasks repeated. Movements became predictable. Workers learned their roles quickly. Mistakes became easier to spot and correct. For customers, this simplicity created clarity. You didn't need time to decide. You didn't need to study a board of options. You ordered, you waited, you ate. The experience was straightforward. Because the restaurant served a local audience, there was no expectation that it needed to appeal broadly. It existed to meet nearby demand, not to represent an idea. If people liked it, they returned. If they didn't, they chose something else nearby. This limited reach kept pressure low. The restaurant did not need to scale its identity. It only needed to function. In this way, the simplicity of the menu reflected the simplicity of the moment. Burger King was still operating within a small radius, geographic and conceptual. Its food was not yet designed to travel. Its name was not yet meant to be recognized. It was simply one place, serving a small number of items to people who lived or passed close by. And for that stage, that was enough. As the restaurant settled into its routines, certain patterns became easier to see. Some hours were busier than others. Some movements in the kitchen worked better than others. When things flowed smoothly, more people could be served without adding much effort. Speed, at this stage, was not about rushing. It was about reducing friction. Small adjustments made a difference. Where ingredients were placed, how tasks were divided, which steps could happen at the same time. These were practical observations, not abstract ideas. They came from watching the day unfold and noticing where it slowed. Serving more people did not yet mean expanding outward. It meant handling the present moment better. A busy lunch hour, an unexpected rush, a line that needed to keep moving. Efficiency became a quiet goal, not because growth demanded it, but because smooth operation made work easier for everyone involved. The idea that these routines might repeat elsewhere had not fully formed. But the possibility was there. If this arrangement worked here, it might work again under similar conditions. That thought did not arrive as a plan. It arrived as a question. Could the same layout work in another location? Could the same menu support a different crowd? Could the same rhythm be learned by another group of workers? These questions were practical, not ambitious. They did not assume success. They simply wondered about repetition. Scale, at this point, was not about size. It was about reliability, about whether a way of working could survive being copied. The restaurant was still small, still local. But within its daily routines, the earliest outlines of a system were beginning to appear. Nothing fixed, nothing finalized, just a growing awareness that some ways of doing things made the day easier, and could perhaps do so again elsewhere. Certain patterns became easier to see. Some hours were busier than others. Some movements in the kitchen worked better than others. When things flowed smoothly, more people could be served without adding much effort. Speed, at this stage, was not about rushing. It was about reducing friction. Small adjustments made a difference. Where ingredients were placed, how tasks were divided, which steps could happen at the same time. These were practical observations, not abstract ideas. They came from watching the day unfold and noticing where it slowed. Serving more people did not yet mean expanding outward. It meant handling the present moment better. A busy lunch hour, an unexpected rush, a line that needed to keep moving. Efficiency became a quiet goal, not because growth demanded it, but because smooth operation made work easier for everyone involved. The idea that these routines might repeat elsewhere had not fully formed. But the possibility was there. If this arrangement worked here, it might work again under similar conditions. That thought did not arrive as a plan. It arrived as a question. Could the same layout work in another location? Could the same menu support a different crowd? Could the same rhythm be learned by another group of workers? These questions were practical, not ambitious. They did not assume success. They simply wondered about repetition. Scale, at this point, was not about size. It was about reliability, about whether a way of working could survive being copied. The restaurant was still small, still local. But within its daily routines, the earliest outlines of a system were beginning to appear. Nothing fixed, nothing finalized, just a growing awareness that some ways of doing things made the day easier, and could perhaps do so again elsewhere. Once work in the kitchen was divided into stations, something else became clear. Doing the same task repeatedly changed how the work felt. When a person repeated the same motion over and over, the need to think about it faded. Hands learned what to do. Movements became automatic. This wasn't about working faster. It was about working with less effort. Each decision that could be removed made the day easier. What to grab, where to stand, which step came next. When these choices were settled in advance, attention could relax. Mistakes became easier to notice because there were fewer variables. Repetition created familiarity, and familiarity reduced strain. For the people working in the kitchen, this meant fewer surprises. For the operation as a whole, it meant steadier output. Food came together in the same way each time, not because anyone was forcing it, but because the process supported it. This kind of repetition also made training simpler. New workers could be shown a single task and practice it until it felt natural. They didn't need to understand the entire system. They only needed to understand their part. As more people learned the same movements, work became interchangeable. One person could step away and another could take their place without disrupting the flow. Repetition did not eliminate skill. It reshaped it. Skill became about consistency rather than creativity, about doing something well again and again. Over time, this approach changed expectations. If a process worked once, it was expected to work again and again. This reliability was comforting. It allowed restaurants to handle busy moments without feeling chaotic, and it made the experience more predictable for everyone involved. In this way, repetition quietly became a form of efficiency. Not loud, not rushed, just steady. As kitchens became more organized, attention shifted away from individual dishes and toward movement itself. What mattered most was not the meal in isolation, but how many meals could move through the space without interruption. Timing became important. Not exact seconds, but relative moments. When one task finished, another needed to be ready to begin. Cooking, assembling, and serving were no longer separate acts. They overlapped. One person's work was timed to meet another's. If something slowed, the entire flow felt it. So kitchens were arranged to encourage coordination. Stations were placed in sequence. Food moved forward, never backward. Hands passed items along almost without pause. This created a rhythm. Not a rushed one, but a steady, repeating pattern. When the rhythm held, the kitchen felt calm, even when it was busy. Workers didn't need to watch the clock. They watched each other. Small cues replaced instructions. A glance, a movement, an item placed where it was expected. Over time, this coordination became familiar. The kitchen began to feel less like a collection of individuals and more like a single process. This is why fast food often feels choreographed, not because anyone is performing, but because the work has been arranged to move smoothly from one step to the next. Meals appear quickly not through speed alone, but through alignment. Everyone doing a small part at the right moment. Designing movement instead of meals allowed kitchens to remain steady under pressure. It reduced bottlenecks. It softened busy periods, and it made the experience predictable for the people working and for the people waiting. By the time food reached the counter, most of the work had already happened quietly, guided by timing and coordination rather than improvisation. This way of working did not draw attention to itself. It simply worked. And because it worked reliably, it could be repeated, again and again. When the Whopper was introduced, it was not framed as a disruption. It did not arrive with the promise of reinvention or a challenge to everything that came before it. Instead, it offered something simple: size. In a growing fast food landscape where many items felt small and uniform, the Whopper stood out by feeling substantial. Not extravagant, not complex, just noticeably larger. This difference did not require explanation. It could be seen immediately. The idea was quiet, but effective. A larger sandwich suggested value. It suggested satisfaction. It suggested that one item could be enough. Importantly, this sense of difference lived mostly in perception. The ingredients were familiar. The preparation followed the same system-driven logic that shaped the rest of the kitchen. But the experience felt distinct. Holding a larger sandwich changed how people thought about the meal. It created a sense of choice without adding complexity. Burger King did not need to change how it worked to support this idea. The Whopper fit neatly into existing workflows. It moved through the same stations. It followed the same timing. What changed was how it was received. Customers did not have to learn something new. They simply noticed the difference. Standing out did not require speed. It did not require novelty. It required contrast. In this way, the Whopper functioned as a philosophy more than a product. It suggested that differentiation could be achieved without altering the system itself, that a familiar process could support a slightly different outcome. The sandwich became a symbol, not of excess, but of choice. It allowed Burger King to exist alongside other fast food restaurants without demanding attention. The Whopper did not compete loudly. It waited to be noticed. And for many people, that was enough. As fast food systems became more standardized, something subtle was lost. Uniformity made food predictable, but it could also feel impersonal. Burger King's response was not to undo the system, but to soften how it felt. The phrase, "have it your way," did not promise freedom without limits. It offered reassurance. It suggested that even within a structured process, there was room for preference. No pickles, extra lettuce. A small change, made familiar. These options were carefully contained. Customization did not mean redesigning the meal. It meant adjusting it slightly. The kitchen did not pause to invent something new. It followed the same steps, with a minor variation along the way. This balance was important. Too much flexibility would slow everything down. Too little would feel rigid. Have it your way sat in between. It allowed customers to feel seen without disrupting the flow of work behind the counter. The campaign itself was calm in tone. It did not shout. It did not challenge. It simply reminded people that choice still existed inside a predictable system. In practice, this choice was limited, and intentionally so. Only certain changes were allowed. Only those that could be handled consistently. This made customization reliable. Customers learned what they could ask for. Workers learned how to accommodate it without confusion. Over time, this created trust. People knew their preferences could be respected without creating problems. Uniformity remained the foundation. Customization became a layer on top, not a rejection of the system, but a human touch within it. Have it your way worked because it did not promise more than it could deliver. It acknowledged the reality of fast food while offering a sense of personal control. And in a world becoming increasingly standardized, that small reassurance mattered. Over time, the Whopper became more than a menu item. It became a reference point, not because it changed often, but because it didn't. In a world where new products were introduced regularly, the Whopper remained recognizable, the same name. the same general shape, the same expectation. This familiarity carried meaning. People knew what they were ordering before they reached the counter. There was comfort in that knowledge. The sandwich did not rely on surprise. It did not ask to be discovered. Its value came from being known. This lack of mystery was intentional. Burger King did not need the Whopper to feel exclusive or innovative. It needed it to feel stable, a consistent presence in a changing environment. The sandwich acted as a quiet anchor. No matter where the restaurant was located, the Whopper represented the same idea. A substantial meal, a familiar experience, a dependable choice. Its symbolism wasn't created through storytelling or myth. It came from repetition, from being ordered again and again by people who wanted something predictable. In this way, the Whopper reflected the broader philosophy of the system behind it. Novelty was not the goal. Reliability was. The sandwich did not evolve to keep attention. It remained steady to maintain trust. Meaning emerged not from mystery, but from consistency, from knowing that something would be there, unchanged, when it was needed. As fast food became more integrated into daily life, this kind of stability mattered. People did not always want to choose something new. They wanted to choose something familiar. The Whopper offered that familiarity without explanation. It did not compete loudly. It simply existed. And through that quiet presence, it became symbolic, not of innovation, but of reassurance. In turn, they would follow an established way of doing things. This arrangement changed the nature of growth. Expansion no longer depended on centralized control. It depended on alignment. The company provided the system. The franchisee provided the day-to-day care. Responsibilities were divided. Burger King did not need to manage every shift, every hire, or every local challenge. Franchise owners handled those details. At the same time, the system needed to be clear enough to function without constant oversight. Instructions had to travel well. Expectations had to be understood at a distance. Franchising worked best when both sides benefited. The company gained reach without owning every building. Franchisees gained a recognizable framework without starting from nothing. Neither side operated alone. This shared responsibility created stability. Local owners had a reason to care deeply about their restaurant. The company had a reason to support them with processes that worked consistently. Growth, in this model, was not about rapid takeover. It was about replication. Finding people willing to operate within a system and trusting that system to hold its shape across distance. Franchising allowed Burger King to expand without stretching itself thin. It made growth quieter, more distributed, less centralized. And for a business built on repetition and familiarity, that mattered. Once franchising made expansion possible, another challenge appeared: distance. Restaurants would no longer exist near a single center. They would operate across cities, states, and eventually countries. Burger King could not be everywhere at once. This meant trusting others to represent the brand in places far removed from where it began. Trust did not come from personal familiarity. It came from structure. The system needed to be clear enough that it could function without constant supervision. At the same time, it needed to be flexible enough to account for local conditions. This balance was delicate. Too much control would slow everything down. Too little would allow confusion to spread. Distance introduced uncertainty. Different locations faced different challenges, different staffing needs, different rhythms of the day. Yet the experience still needed to feel recognizable. Trust, in this context, was not emotional. It was practical. It rested on the belief that the system itself could guide behavior when direct oversight was impossible. Franchisees were trusted to operate within defined boundaries. They were expected to follow established patterns, not because someone was watching, but because those patterns made the work easier. The system reduced guesswork. It gave people a clear sense of what to do and what mattered. This clarity helped prevent chaos. When everyone worked from the same expectations, distance became manageable. A restaurant could feel familiar even when it was far from home. Trust across miles did not require constant correction. It relied on consistency, on shared understanding, on routines that held together even when the people involved had never met. In this way, Burger King was able to exist in many places at once without fragmenting. The brand did not travel through personality. It traveled through process. And because the process was steady, distance did not unravel it. It simply extended it. As restaurants spread farther apart, direct supervision became less practical. No single person could observe every kitchen, every shift, every decision. Instead, guidance had to take a different form. Rules were written down. Processes were documented. Expectations were made clear in advance. Manuals replaced constant instruction. These materials were not designed to inspire. They were designed to remove uncertainty. They explained how work should be done when no one was there to answer questions. What temperature to use, how long something should cook, where items should be placed. The goal was not control for its own sake. It was consistency. When people understood the rules, they could work with confidence. They didn't need approval for every action. They didn't need constant correction. The system quietly enforced itself. If a process was followed, the outcome was predictable. If it wasn't, problems appeared quickly and visibly. This kind of enforcement did not rely on authority. It relied on structure. Workers learned that following the system made their jobs easier. Franchise owners learned that consistency protected their investment. The rules were not present as pressure. They were present as support. They allowed restaurants to operate even when leadership was far away. Consistency emerged not because someone was watching, but because the process guided behavior. In this way, Burger King could maintain a familiar experience across great distances without constant intervention. The system carried the weight. Supervision became occasional rather than continuous. Correction became quieter. What mattered most was that the work could continue smoothly on its own. Rules and manuals made that possible. They allowed the brand to exist without needing to be everywhere at once. And in doing so, they made distance feel manageable, not chaotic. As Burger King expanded into more locations, a subtle reality became impossible to avoid. No two places were ever exactly the same. Ingredients arrived from different suppliers. Buildings sat in different climates. People brought their own habits and rhythms to the work. Despite shared systems and clear instructions, variation still existed, and that variation was accepted. The goal was never perfect sameness. It was recognizable sameness. A Whopper in one city might taste slightly different from a Whopper in another. The bun might feel softer. The lettuce might be cut a little differently. The timing might vary by a few moments. These differences were not seen as failures. They were understood as part of operating in the real world. Consistency, in this context, meant staying within a familiar range, close enough that expectations were met, close enough that nothing felt surprising. This idea of acceptable sameness allowed the system to breathe. It acknowledged that people are not machines, that environments influence outcomes. Trying to eliminate every difference would have required constant correction and increasing pressure. Instead, the system focused on boundaries. As long as the food fell within those boundaries, the experience was considered successful. Customers were not expecting perfection. They were expecting familiarity. They wanted to recognize what they ordered, to feel reassured by the result. This approach reduced tension on both sides of the counter. Workers did not need to chase an impossible ideal. They needed to meet a shared understanding. Consistency became about reliability, not flawlessness, about knowing what something would be like, even if it wasn't identical every time. In choosing acceptable sameness over perfection, Burger King made room for scale. The system could extend across distances without breaking under the weight of tiny differences. And for people eating there, that was more than enough. As the system expanded, another idea became clearer. Excellence, when defined narrowly, does not always travel well. Perfect execution depends on conditions lining up: time, attention, and individual skill. Those conditions are difficult to reproduce again and again across many places. Predictability, on the other hand, is easier to share. It asks a different question. Not, is this the best version possible? But, is this the version people expect? When expectations are met consistently, trust builds quietly. People learn what to anticipate. They adjust their choices accordingly. This kind of reliability has value. It reduces uncertainty. It lowers the effort required to decide. For customers, knowing roughly what a meal will be like is often more comforting than the possibility of something exceptional. For the system, aiming for good enough creates stability. It allows processes to be taught quickly. It allows outcomes to stay within a narrow range. It allows new locations to open without reinventing how work is done. This does not mean care is absent. It means care is directed toward consistency rather than perfection, toward making sure the experience does not surprise. When something works reliably, it can be repeated. When it can be repeated, it can spread. This is how scale becomes possible, not by elevating every moment, but by smoothing them. Burger King's system leaned into this understanding. By valuing predictability over excellence, it created an experience people could depend on. And over time, that dependability became its own form of quality, one that could exist in many places at once. Over time, consistency creates something deeper than reliability. It creates comfort. When people know what to expect, their attention can rest. They don't need to evaluate every detail. They don't need to weigh options carefully. They don't need to prepare for surprise. Familiarity removes that effort. Walking into a familiar restaurant brings a quiet sense of orientation. The layout feels known. The menu feels readable. The process feels understandable. Even small details. The sound of the kitchen, the rhythm of ordering, the way food is handed over, carry a sense of recognition. This recognition eases decision-making. It allows people to move through the experience without tension. For many, this matters more than the food itself. A familiar place offers a brief moment where nothing new is required. No learning, no adapting, no adjustment, just participation. Emotional ease is difficult to measure, but it influences behavior strongly. People return to places where they feel comfortable being present, not because those places are exceptional, but because they are predictable. Burger King's system leaned into this quiet truth. By offering the same general experience across many locations, it allowed people to carry expectations with them. A stop during a long drive, a familiar option in an unfamiliar town, a place where the experience feels already understood. This familiarity did not demand attention. It reduced it, and in reducing attention, it offered rest. The comfort came not from perfection, but from recognition, from knowing what would happen next. In this way, familiarity became part of the value, not as excitement, but as ease, a feeling that asked very little and gave reassurance in return. As systems became more refined, the physical space of the restaurant began to matter more. Not just what happened in the kitchen, but how the building itself guided behavior. Floor plans started to repeat. Counters appeared in familiar positions. Kitchens followed similar shapes. Storage, preparation, and service areas were arranged in the same general order. This repetition was intentional. When spaces are laid out the same way, people don't need to relearn them. Workers could step into a new location and immediately understand where things belonged. Their bodies recognized the space before their minds did. This is where muscle memory comes in. Movements learned in one restaurant translated easily to another. Where to turn, where to reach, where to stand. The building itself taught the work. This reduced hesitation. People moved with confidence because the environment felt familiar. Training became simpler. Adjustment periods became shorter. The space supported the process. For customers, this repetition created a different kind of familiarity. Entering a restaurant felt intuitive. You knew where to order, where to wait, where to sit. You didn't need signs to explain everything. The layout quietly guided you. These identical floor plans turned buildings into tools, not expressive, not unique, but reliable. Each location became part of a larger pattern, a place where movement made sense because it had already made sense elsewhere. Restaurants in this way began to function like machines, not cold or mechanical, but dependable. Spaces designed to do the same thing, again and again, with minimal adjustment. By repeating the physical layout, Burger King reduced uncertainty for both workers and customers. The building carried part of the system's weight. And when space itself supports behavior, everything else becomes easier to maintain. As restaurants continued to refine how people moved through them, another space took on greater importance: the drive-thru. Unlike the dining room, the drive-thru was designed around motion from the beginning. Cars entered at one end. Orders were placed along the way. Food emerged at the other. There were no choices about where to stand or where to go next. The path was set. This created a kind of controlled flow. Each car followed the one before it. Each step happened in a known sequence. Waiting still existed, but it was contained. You could see where you were in line. You could sense progress. Even when the line was long, the movement felt orderly. This predictability mattered. People are often more comfortable waiting when the wait feels structured. The drive-thru offered that structure. Time passed in small, visible increments. One car moved forward, another order was handed out. Nothing unexpected was required. From the restaurant's perspective, the drive-thru simplified coordination. Orders arrived in a steady stream. Timing could be anticipated. Work could be paced. The kitchen adjusted to the rhythm of the line rather than reacting to sudden surges. For customers, the experience felt contained. You remained in your car. The environment stayed familiar. There were no new decisions to make. The drive-thru became a kind of tunnel through time. You entered. You moved forward. You exited. The process did not ask for attention or effort. It carried you through. This design reduced uncertainty on both sides. Workers knew what to expect next. Customers knew roughly how long things would take. Waiting became predictable, and predictability softened it. In this way, the drive-thru turned time itself into something manageable. Not something to rush through, but something guided gently from beginning to end. And once waiting feels guided, it feels easier to accept. As restaurants grew busier and more widespread, another reality had to be accounted for. People came and went. Jobs in fast food were often temporary. Schedules changed. Staff turnover was expected. Rather than resist this, the system adapted to it. Training was designed to happen quickly. New workers were not asked to master the entire operation. They were taught one role at a time, a single station, a limited set of tasks, clear steps to follow. This made learning manageable. Within a short period, someone could contribute meaningfully without feeling overwhelmed. The work did not rely on long-term familiarity. It relied on clarity. Roles were defined narrowly. Responsibilities were clear. If one person left, another could step in with minimal disruption. This made roles replaceable, not because people were unimportant, but because the system did not depend on any single individual. Replaceability reduced pressure. Workers were not expected to improvise. They were expected to follow a process that had already been tested. This allowed consistency to survive even as people changed. For managers, this reduced uncertainty. Staffing challenges did not threaten the operation. Training followed a known path. For workers, the expectations were clear. There was comfort in knowing what was required and what was not. The system absorbed turnover without drawing attention to it. Restaurants continued to function even as faces changed. In this way, the machine-like quality of the restaurant became supportive rather than harsh. It allowed the work to continue without constant adjustment. Training designed for turnover made the restaurant resilient, not by demanding more from people, but by asking less of any one person. And that resilience allowed the system to remain steady, even as everything else shifted. As Burger King grew more familiar, its marketing followed a similar path. It did not become more complex. It became more concise. Over the decades, Burger King relied on short phrases, simple combinations of words that could be remembered without effort. These slogans were not designed to explain the business. They did not describe processes or advantages in detail. They acted more like markers, something recognizable, something easy to hold on to. A few words, repeated often, became enough. This approach respected attention rather than competing for it. People did not need to stop and think. They did not need to decode meaning. The phrase arrived, and it stayed. Easy recall mattered. In a crowded environment filled with messages, short slogans created calm. They reduced the amount of information being asked of the listener. You could encounter them briefly, on a sign, on a screen, in passing, and still recognize what they belonged to. The slogans worked because they matched the broader system. Just as menus were limited, language was kept simple. Just as processes repeated, phrases repeated too. Over time, these words became familiar companions. They didn't demand excitement. They didn't promise transformation. They reminded people that the restaurant was there, that it had been there before, and that it would likely be there again. This kind of messaging did not need urgency. It relied on continuity. Short phrases allowed the brand to remain present without asking for attention. They fit easily into memory and stayed there quietly. In this way, marketing became less about persuasion and more about recognition. Not trying to be discovered, but easy to remember. And for a system built on familiarity, that was enough. Alongside simple language, Burger King relied on something even quieter. Visual familiarity. Colors and shapes repeated over time, not to stand out aggressively, but to be recognized easily. From a distance, you could tell what a place was before reading a word. The building's outline, the shape of the sign, the combination of colors. These elements worked together to create recognition without effort. You didn't need to focus. You didn't need to analyze. Your eyes understood quickly and moved on. This mattered most when people were in motion, driving past, approaching from far away, scanning the environment without stopping. Recognition at distance reduced uncertainty. You knew what kind of place it was before deciding whether to stop. That knowledge brought comfort. It removed the need to investigate. It removed the need to guess. Sameness, in this context, was not about boredom. It was about reassurance. Seeing familiar colors and shapes meant knowing what to expect inside. The experience had already begun before you entered the building. Over time, these visuals became part of the landscape. They blended into everyday surroundings without disappearing. Present, but not demanding. This consistency allowed Burger King to exist quietly alongside other places without needing to compete visually. The design did not chase novelty. It stayed readable, readable from far away, readable in passing, readable even when attention was limited. Comfort came from this steadiness, from knowing that what you saw matched what you would experience. In a world full of changing signs and shifting designs, familiar shapes offered a small moment of certainty. and that certainty made the brand easier to live with. Not exciting, not mysterious, simply recognizable. As familiarity settled in, Burger King no longer needed to explain itself. The name was known. The experience was understood. This allowed marketing to become quieter. There was less need to describe what the restaurant was, or how it worked, or what it offered. Recognition carried that weight. When people already understand something, explanation becomes unnecessary. The brand could simply be present. A sign on the road, a building at an intersection, a familiar option during a long day. This presence did not require constant messaging. It relied on memory. People knew what a stop would involve before making it. They did not need convincing. They needed availability. This shift reduced effort on both sides. The brand did not have to compete aggressively for attention. The customer did not have to evaluate a choice. Recognition shortened the distance between awareness and decision. It made the experience feel easier. Over time, Burger King became part of the environment rather than something that stood apart from it. Not a destination, but an option. One that could be chosen without thought. This kind of presence is difficult to create but easy to maintain once established. It depends on consistency rather than novelty, on being where people expect you to be, when they expect you to be there. Marketing, at this stage, was less about speaking and more about staying visible, not louder, not more persuasive, just reliably present. In this way, recognition did most of the work. It allowed the brand to exist comfortably within daily routines, and by asking for very little attention, it received continued trust in return. As fast food systems matured, one choice remained surprisingly consistent. Menus stayed small. This was not because more options were impossible, but because fewer options worked better. Every additional item on a menu adds a decision, and decisions require attention. When menus are large, people pause longer. They compare, they hesitate. This hesitation slows everything around it. A smaller menu reduces that friction. It allows choices to be made quickly, sometimes almost automatically. People recognize what they want before they finish reading. This ease matters, not because speed is demanded, but because effort is reduced. Ordering becomes simpler. Waiting becomes shorter. Behind the counter, the same principle applies. Fewer menu items mean fewer ingredients, fewer preparations, fewer things that can interrupt the flow. The kitchen can focus on repetition rather than adjustment. This allows service to remain steady even during busy periods. Faster service in this context is not about rushing. It is about smoothness. Orders arrive in predictable patterns. Food moves through familiar paths. Nothing needs to be rethought in the moment. For customers, this creates a subtle sense of calm. You are not asked to evaluate dozens of options. You are not asked to customize endlessly. You choose from what is offered, knowing it has been designed to work. This limitation can feel relieving. It removes the pressure to decide perfectly. The menu does not challenge you. It supports you. Over time, people learn what they like and return to it. The menu becomes a guide rather than a question. By keeping menus small, Burger King preserved a sense of ease. Not by offering everything, but by offering enough. Enough to satisfy. Enough to be familiar. Enough to keep the experience moving gently forward. And in a world filled with constant choices, that simplicity has quiet value. Behind a small menu, there is often a quieter benefit: simplicity. When a restaurant offers fewer items, it needs fewer ingredients. Storage becomes easier to manage. Supplies are easier to track. There is less uncertainty about what will be needed from one day to the next. This steadiness reduces strain. Deliveries follow predictable patterns. Ingredients are used regularly. Waste becomes easier to notice and prevent. Nothing sits unused for long. Inventory, in this way, stays close to the rhythm of the restaurant itself. This same simplicity affects training. When there are fewer items to prepare, there are fewer steps to learn. New workers are not overwhelmed by options. They are introduced to a limited set of tasks that repeat throughout the day. Learning becomes focused. People can become comfortable with their role without needing to remember many variations. Confidence builds more quickly when expectations are clear. This clarity benefits everyone involved. Managers spend less time correcting mistakes. Workers spend less time guessing. The system supports them quietly. Operational simplicity does not call attention to itself. It works in the background. It allows the restaurant to function smoothly, without constant intervention. For customers, this simplicity is rarely visible, but it is felt. Orders arrive as expected. Delays are less common. The experience feels steady. By reducing complexity behind the scenes, Burger King was able to preserve calm at the front of the counter. The restaurant did not need to explain this simplicity. It did not need to advertise it. It was embedded in how the place worked. And over time, that simplicity made the entire system easier to maintain. Not by doing more, but by keeping things manageable. Over time, the effect of limited choice becomes noticeable, not as a loss, but as a relief. Throughout the day, people make decisions constantly. Large ones, small ones, many of them without pause. What to do next, where to go, how much time something will take. By the time someone arrives to eat, their attention is often already tired. A smaller menu eases that fatigue. It does not ask for comparison. It does not ask for optimization. It presents a short list of familiar options and allows the decision to happen quickly. This simplicity is calming. You are not asked to weigh possibilities. You are not asked to imagine outcomes. You choose something you already recognize and move forward. Predictability plays a quiet role here. Knowing roughly what a meal will be like reduces mental effort. There is no need to anticipate surprises, no need to prepare for disappointment. The experience unfolds as expected. This predictability extends beyond the food itself. The ordering process, the waiting, the receiving of the meal. Each step follows a known pattern. This allows people to relax their attention. They can think about other things, or about nothing at all. Limited choice creates space. Space for rest, space for conversation, space for quiet. In this way, the menu supports more than service speed. It supports emotional ease. The absence of endless options can feel supportive rather than restrictive. It signals that the experience has been considered in advance, that someone has already made the difficult decisions so the customer does not have to. Burger King's approach to limited choice fit naturally within its broader system, not because it restricted people, but because it reduced demands on them. And in a world filled with constant input, that reduction mattered. Calm predictability became part of the experience. Not something to notice directly, but something to feel. As fast food became more common, Burger King did not grow alone. Other restaurants were expanding at the same time, often along the same roads, sometimes across the street from one another. This proximity was not unusual. It became expected. Fast food chains learned to exist beside one another, sharing space rather than competing directly for attention. A customer might pass several familiar options in a short distance, each offering something similar, each serving a different preference. Growth happened in parallel. Restaurants expanded outward, not to replace what was already there, but to join an existing landscape. This kind of coexistence reduced urgency. There was no need to dominate every location, no requirement to be the only option available. Being present was enough. Each chain settled into its role, occupying a recognizable position in people's routines. Some stops felt quicker, some felt quieter, some felt more familiar at certain times of day. These differences did not need to be emphasized. Customers chose based on habit, convenience, or familiarity, often without thinking about it. Parallel growth allowed stability. When multiple chains grew together, no single one needed to carry the entire weight of expectation. Fast food became infrastructure rather than novelty, a collection of options that blended into everyday movement. This shared presence softened competition. Restaurants were no longer trying to persuade people to switch. They were offering consistency to those who already recognized them. Burger King's system fit comfortably into this arrangement. It did not need to outpace others. It needed to remain recognizable. By growing alongside other chains rather than against them, Burger King avoided urgency. Its role was not to win attention, but to be available. And in a landscape shaped by repetition and familiarity, that quiet presence was enough. Although fast food chains often appeared close together, their systems were not identical. Each company made small choices about how it wanted to operate. Menus varied slightly. Layouts differed in subtle ways. Service rhythms developed their own patterns. These differences were not dramatic. They did not redefine the industry. But they mattered. One system might emphasize speed at certain moments. Another might prioritize a particular style of ordering. Another might focus on how food was assembled or presented. From the outside, these places could look very similar. From the inside, the work felt different. Employees learned different habits. Customers experienced different rhythms. Yet the underlying goals remained aligned. Serve food efficiently, remain familiar, fit easily into daily routines. No chain was attempting to invent a new way of eating. They were all responding to the same needs. People wanted something quick, something predictable, something easy to access. The differences between systems were refinements, not revolutions. Each company adjusted its approach to suit its own history and identity. Burger King's path reflected its emphasis on familiarity, on modest flexibility, on steady repetition. It did not need to match every choice made elsewhere. It only needed to function well within its own structure. This allowed multiple systems to coexist, each one recognizable, each one reliable in its own way. Customers moved between them naturally, often without conscious comparison. The industry became a collection of parallel solutions to the same everyday problem: how to feed people quickly and consistently without demanding much attention. By following a slightly different path, Burger King maintained its place without urgency. Its system did not need to be the best. It needed to be dependable. And in an industry built around repetition, dependability was a shared goal. As fast food settled into everyday life, success began to look different. Growth was no longer measured only by speed or by how quickly new locations appeared. It was measured by staying power. Burger King did not need to replace other chains to remain relevant. It did not need to become the largest or the most visible. It needed to last. Longevity required restraint. Opening new locations had to make sense within the existing system. Too much expansion could strain processes. It could dilute familiarity. It could introduce instability. Stability instead became the priority. Restaurants were added gradually. Operations were reinforced rather than stretched. The goal was not to take over territory, but to remain a dependable option where people already expected one to exist. This approach reduced pressure. There was no urgency to dominate markets or to outpace competitors. Burger King could grow at a pace that preserved consistency. This allowed the system to mature. Procedures settled, expectations solidified. The brand became part of the background. People encountered it as something established, not something constantly changing. Growth without dominance also meant coexistence. Other chains continued to operate. Customers continued to choose freely. Burger King's presence did not rely on exclusivity. It relied on familiarity. By valuing stability over rapid expansion, the company avoided sudden shifts that could disrupt trust. Restaurants remained recognizable over time. This kind of growth is quieter. It does not draw attention to itself. It does not promise transformation. It simply continues. And in an industry built on routine, continuation becomes its own form of success. Burger King's system was not designed to conquer. It was designed to endure. And by focusing on longevity rather than takeover, it secured a place that could remain steady for decades. As fast food became part of everyday movement, its role began to shift. Restaurants were no longer destinations. They became landmarks. Places noticed in passing, points of reference along familiar routes. A Burger King on a corner, near a highway exit, or beside a long stretch of road served as a waypoint, something to orient around. People didn't always stop. Often, they simply noticed it was there. That presence mattered. Seeing a familiar restaurant confirmed where you were, or how far you had gone, or how close you were to where you were heading. These locations became part of mental maps, a reminder that a certain kind of stop was available if it was needed. For travelers, this familiarity offered reassurance. You didn't need to research. You didn't need to explore unfamiliar options. You already understood what the stop would be like. For people moving through their daily routines, these places marked transitions. The point where errands paused, the place between work and home. A reliable stop during long or uncertain days. Fast food locations did not demand engagement. They simply existed in predictable places, near roads, near intersections, near the flow of daily life. Over time, this presence became infrastructural. Like gas stations or rest areas, fast food restaurants blended into the systems that support movement. They were not central to the journey, but they supported it. Burger King's consistent placement allowed it to function as one of these quiet markers. A place you could count on being there, even if you didn't plan to stop. Landmarks like these reduce mental effort. They make environments easier to navigate. They offer familiarity in motion. And by becoming part of this background structure, Burger King shifted from being just a restaurant to being part of how people move through space. A familiar stop waiting quietly along the way. When people travel, familiar routines often fall away. Schedules change, environments shift, small uncertainties add up. In those moments, familiar places take on a different role. A Burger King seen far from home is not just a restaurant. It is something known in an unfamiliar setting. The menu is already understood. The ordering process is familiar. The waiting feels predictable. This predictability offers comfort, not excitement, not discovery. Just a sense that one small part of the journey will unfold as expected. On long drives, this matters. Travel demands attention. Navigation, timing, and distance all require effort. Stopping somewhere familiar reduces that effort. You don't need to learn how things work. You don't need to adapt. You already know what to do. This allows the mind to rest briefly before continuing on. Fast food restaurants became reliable companions on the road. They appeared at regular intervals, often near exits or intersections where stopping felt natural. Their presence reassured travelers that they were not far from something recognizable. Even if plans changed, even if delays occurred, a familiar stop remained available. This consistency made travel feel less isolating. Being away from home did not mean being entirely disconnected from routine. A familiar place offered a moment of grounding. The experience inside did not depend on location. Whether near home or hundreds of miles away, the structure remained the same. This sameness was not dull. It was stabilizing. It allowed travelers to carry a small piece of familiarity with them. Over time, these repeated experiences shaped how people thought about travel. Routes were remembered not only by distance, but by the places that could be counted on along the way. Fast food became part of the infrastructure of movement, not something that defined the journey, but something that supported it quietly. And in doing so, it helped make unfamiliar places feel When people return to the same place again and again, it is rarely because of a single decision. More often it happens gradually. A memory forms. A routine settles in. The first visit may be intentional. Later visits require less thought. Over time, the place becomes familiar in a quiet, unremarkable way. People remember how it feels to be there. Not every detail, but the general experience. The order of steps, the pacing, the absence of surprises. These memories do not need to be strong to be effective. They simply need to be consistent. Routine builds on this consistency. A stop after work, a place to eat during a long drive, a familiar option when nothing else sounds appealing. The decision to return becomes automatic, not because it is the best possible choice, but because it is the easiest one to make. This ease has economic value. When a decision requires little effort, it is more likely to be repeated. Over time, patterns form. People return not out of loyalty, but out of familiarity. The place fits into the shape of their day. Burger King's system supported this process quietly. It did not try to create strong emotional attachment. It did not rely on novelty. It relied on being remembered in a simple, usable way. Routine does not demand attention. It thrives on predictability. When something fits into routine, it becomes part of how time is structured. Meals become markers in the day. Stops become expected. Memory and routine reinforce each other. The more often a place is visited, the less thought it requires to return. This creates a stable relationship. Not dramatic, not deeply personal, but dependable. In this way, familiarity shapes behavior without pressure. It allows people to move through their days with fewer decisions to make. And over time, those small reductions in effort add up. Many decisions are made quietly, without calculation. They are guided less by logic and more by how something feels. In everyday life, people rarely optimize. They choose what is close, what is familiar, what requires the least adjustment. This is not carelessness. It is efficiency of a different kind. Emotional economics values ease. It recognizes that attention is limited and energy is unevenly distributed throughout the day. After long hours, complex decisions feel heavier. In those moments, comfort becomes more important than improvement. A familiar option offers relief. It does not ask to be evaluated. It does not demand comparison. It allows a person to move forward without reopening the decision-making process. This is why optimization often loses to comfort. Not because optimization is wrong, but because it is costly. It requires thought. It requires energy. Choosing ease preserves both. Burger King's system aligned with this reality. It did not position itself as the best possible choice for every moment. It positioned itself as a dependable one, something that could be selected without hesitation. This lowered the emotional cost of choosing. People did not need to weigh trade-offs. They did not need to justify the decision. They could simply act. Comfort, in this sense, is not indulgence. It is conservation, a way of managing limited attention across many decisions. When a system supports comfort, it becomes easier to return to, not because it excites, but because it fits. It occupies a space where friction has been reduced. Over time, this ease reinforces itself. The more often a choice is made without difficulty, the more natural it feels to repeat. Emotional economics does not reward intensity. It rewards stability. It favors experiences that do not ask much and do not surprise. By prioritizing comfort over optimization, Burger King aligned with how people actually move through their days. Not striving for the best, but settling into what feels manageable. And in that choice, ease became its own form of value. Trust rarely appears all at once. It builds quietly, through repeated experiences that unfold as expected. When something behaves the same way again and again, confidence grows without effort. No promises are required. No explanations are needed. The system speaks for itself. In everyday life, trust is often practical rather than emotional. People trust what works, what doesn't surprise them, what fits smoothly into routine. Repetition plays an important role here. Each familiar experience reinforces the last. Each uneventful visit confirms the one before it. Nothing dramatic happens, and that is precisely the point. Calm reliability creates reassurance. When a system is reliable, attention can rest. People do not need to monitor outcomes closely. They do not need to prepare for correction. They know roughly how things will go. Burger King's system was built around this idea. Not around spectacle or constant change, but around repetition that felt steady. Menus stayed recognizable. Processes remained consistent. Spaces looked and functioned in familiar ways. This repetition was not meant to impress. It was meant to reassure. Trust emerged not from promises but from absence of friction, from moments that passed without incident, from experiences that required no explanation. Over time, this created a quiet relationship. People did not think about trusting the system. They simply acted within it. They returned because nothing about the experience made them hesitate. In this way, trust became embedded in structure. It lived in routines, in expectations, in the predictability of outcomes. Systems designed for trust do not ask to be believed. They allow belief to form naturally through calm reliability. And once that trust is established, it becomes self-sustaining. The system does not need to announce itself. It continues quietly, supporting everyday life without drawing attention. As the day comes to an end, the rhythm begins to change. Lights dim slightly, sounds soften, movement slows. In restaurants across many places, closing routines begin. Not all at once, and not hurried. A door is locked. A chair is turned upside down. A counter is wiped clean. These actions are familiar to the people performing them. They happen at the end of each day, often without much thought. Closing time is not dramatic. It is a sequence of small tasks, done in a particular order, because they have always been done that way. The kitchen grows quieter. Machines are turned off one by one. Surfaces cool. The steady activity of the day fades into stillness. Outside, the building remains. The sign may still glow, or it may darken completely. Either way, the structure holds its place. Inside, nothing is being prepared for an audience. There is no performance now, only routine. These quiet moments are rarely noticed. Customers are gone. Traffic is thinned. But the routines continue, supporting the cycle that will begin again tomorrow. Cleaning is not rushed. There is no urgency. Each task exists to make the next day easier. This is how systems rest, not by stopping completely, but by resetting gently. The work that happens at closing time does not create value directly. It creates readiness, readiness for another familiar day, another predictable flow, another set of small, ordinary moments. As the lights dim, the restaurant becomes less visible. It returns to the background, where it spends much of its time, waiting quietly, not for attention, but for the next moment when it will be needed again. And in this quiet pause, the system holds, steady, unremarkable, and ready to begin again. Even after the lights dim, the work does not end. It simply changes. Behind closed doors, or in the early hours when few are watching, systems continue to move. Floors are cleaned, supplies are restocked, machines are checked and reset. These tasks happen without ceremony. There is no audience for this work, no rush to complete it quickly. It exists to support what comes later. Night crews move through familiar routines, often in near silence. They know the space well. They know what needs attention and what can wait. Their work is steady and methodical. Nothing about it is designed to be seen. This kind of labor rarely enters public awareness. Customers do not notice it directly. They feel its effects the next day. A clean counter, a working machine, a space ready to open again. Systems like these depend on continuity. They rely on people doing necessary work even when recognition is unlikely. This quiet labor keeps everything aligned. It prevents small problems from becoming larger ones. It preserves the familiarity that others depend on. The system does not pause just because attention has moved elsewhere. It carries on in the background, maintained by routines that repeat night after night. There is a calm in this repetition, a sense that the work is not urgent, but it is important. It does not need praise. It does not need explanation. It simply needs to be done. As the night passes, the restaurant remains still from the outside. Inside, the conditions for tomorrow are being prepared. By the time morning arrives, most of this work will already be finished, unnoticed but essential. This is how large systems persist. Not through constant visibility, but through attention given quietly when few are looking. And because of that quiet care, everything is ready to begin again. As we reach the end of this story, there's nothing left to explain, no final point to make, no conclusion to reach. The system we've been observing continues on its own, quietly, without needing our attention. If you've been listening closely, thank you for spending this time here. And if you've been drifting in and out, that's just as welcome. These stories are meant to meet you wherever you are. If this felt calming, or if it helped you rest, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe. There's no rush. Doing so simply helps these quiet documentaries find others who may need them. You can also check back anytime for more sleep-focused business stories, told gently, without urgency, and designed to stay in the background. There's nothing else you need to do now. You don't need to remember details. You don't need to think about what you've heard. You can let the story fade as your attention settles elsewhere. If you're listening at night, this is a good moment to rest, to allow the day to close without adding anything new. The lights are already dimmed. The routines are complete. Everything that needs to continue will do so quietly, without effort from you. Thank you for being here. And whenever you return, these stories will be waiting, steady, unhurried, and calm. For now, you're free to rest.